Alright guys, today we are talking about some comments that were recently made by the former PlayStation executive Shawn Layden about the AAA gaming space and how he would personally love to see the return of the 12 to 15 hour AAA video game. He also talks about the rising cost of AAA game development and how, in his opinion, if the price tag of a AAA game is going to remain at $60, he does not think it's sustainable in its current state. And he also talks about how a lot of games are seemingly striving for these 40, 50, 60-hour mark gameplay experiences, but we have to ask ourselves, is that really always necessary, and is that also sustainable? So I think what he has to say here is pretty interesting. I know a lot of you are big fans of Shawn Layden, as am I, and we know that he left Sony sometime last year, and I think this is the first time he's really commenting about anything or talking about anything when it comes to the gaming industry on record since he actually left. So yeah, he's somebody who's worked at PlayStation for about 25 years before he left. He knows what he's talking about, and he's certainly someone you want to pay attention to when he talks about the gaming industry. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're also talking about The Last of Us Part 2 and how it is apparently smashing sales records, and it looks like it could go on to become Sony's best-selling PlayStation 4 exclusive this generation, or maybe even of all time, which frankly does not come as much of a surprise to me. And finally, we are talking about The Last of Us Part 3 and how, according to Neil Druckmann, it would be even harder to make that than Part 2. So I wanted to highlight that as well. So before we go any further, if you could do me a big favor, make sure you hit the like button to show your support and help the video out, and make sure you hit the subscribe button as well so you don't miss any future content. But starting here with what Shawn Layden had to say, says Shawn Layden recalled the days of $1 million production budgets for the biggest games on the market and referred to the stated theory that the cost of development has doubled with every new generation of consoles. The problem with that model is it's just not sustainable, he said, explaining that the current generation has seen the cost of development reach between $80 million and $150 million for most AAA games, excluding marketing costs, with production taking up to 5 years from start to finish. I don't think that in the next generation you can take those numbers and multiply them by 2 and think that you can grow, he continued. I think the industry as a whole needs to sit back and go, alright, what are we building? What's the audience expectation? What is the best way to get our story across and say what we need to say? It's hard for every adventure game to shoot for the 50 to 60 hour gameplay milestone because that's going to be so much more expensive to achieve, and in the end you may close some interesting creators and their stories out of the market if that's the kind of threshold they have to meet. We have to reevaluate that. And he goes on to say, going into the next generation not only is an important role in management, it's also perhaps really evaluating what we can continue to put into games. At what cost can you continue to create these games? The single most important reason why the AAA model is unsustainable is not the escalating cost or team sizes. It's actually the fact that over the course of his 25-year career, the price tag has pretty much remained the same, and the audience is very sensitive to the idea of it ever being higher. It's been $60 ever since I started in the business, but the cost of games have gone up 10 times. If you don't have the elasticity on the price point, but you have huge volatility on the cost line, the model becomes more difficult. I think this generation is going to see those two imperatives collide. For Layden, who has been on a sabbatical since he left Sony, this is a major issue that the AAA industry must solve as the next console generation approaches. Epic Games chose to use the new PlayStation hardware to demonstrate the potential of Unreal Engine 5, and while Tim Sweeney talked up the efficiency its tools will offer to developers, Shawn Layden was absolutely certain of one thing: AAA game development won't be less expensive than the current generation of game development, he said. 4K, HDR art, and creating worlds don't come cheap. All the costs around gaming are labor costs, right? You don't have to build a factory, you don't have to turn sand into glass, it's just creativity and your ability to bring like-minded people together to accomplish something. But it's all based on the people, those are the costs associated with it. So how can we look at that and say, is there another answer? Instead of spending 5 years making an 80-hour game, what does 3 years and a 15-hour game look like? What would be the cost around that? Is that a full experience? Personally, as an older gamer, I would welcome a return to the 12 to 15-hour AAA game. I would finish more games, first of all, and just like a well-edited piece of literature or a movie, looking at the discipline around that could give us a tighter, more compelling content. It's something I'd like to see a return to in this business. So there you go. Those are Shawn Layden's comments. And again, I find them very interesting because it does raise an interesting question, which is, as hardcore gamers, would we want to see the return to the 12 to 15 hour AAA game? And to give my thoughts on this, I'm 100% in agreement with what Shawn Layden's saying here, because for me, it's never been quantity over quality. I mean, I love long games, obviously. I love worlds that I can just get lost in, and games that can take 30, 40, or 50 hours to complete, but only if it feels like it's organic, if it's natural. I don't like it when it feels like it's forced, or there's a lot of padding, or it's just being artificially extended and bloated. To me, that's just never really a good thing, and that's always the big worry with these big open world games. Some do it better than others, but we have to understand that what he's trying to get at here is that we might have no choice but to return to the 12 to 15 hour AAA game, because the cost of development is skyrocketing at a really rapid rate, and not every development team is going to be able to put 7 years of development into a single game, or 5 years of development into a single game, so that way they can make sure this is a 100+ hour experience. And it's just not realistic to do that every single time. That's not to say that we won't still have those games, or that we can't have those games, but we just have to understand that the idea of AAA may not necessarily, it may not necessarily be indicative of how long the game is actually going to be. Because in my opinion, a solid 12-hour experience, single-player experience, if it's quality, if it feels like every hour is meaningful, then yeah, I think that's certainly worth a $60 price tag. The same can be said for a 50-hour game, as long as those 50 hours feel like it was meaningful and it just wasn't a bunch of padding and unnecessary stuff to bloat the game to justify a $60 price tag. So I really want to know what you guys think about this. Again, I think it's just really interesting to hear Shawn Layden talk for the first time since he left Sony, and so we see Sony is kind of already responding to this. We saw what they did with Uncharted Lost Legacy, Ratchet & Clank 2016, and even now with Spider-Man Miles Morales. These are what you would consider AAA games, but at a cheaper price point, because they're not as long or as fleshed out, I guess you could say, as a $60 AAA game would be. So let me know your thoughts about this down in the comments below. But moving right along here, we're talking about the sales of The Last of Us Part 2. It says The Last of Us Part 2 has shot to the top of the UK box charts in significant fashion. The action horror game is Sony's fastest selling release this generation, narrowly beating the opening week of 2016's Uncharted 4 by just over 1%. Download sales are not included in this data, so when we factor in digital sales, it's possible the game's launch was even bigger. The Last of Us Part 2 is comfortably bigger than its PlayStation 3 predecessor, with launch sales 76% higher, although it's worth noting that the PlayStation 4 is a more popular console than the PlayStation 3. As a result, it's the biggest UK launch for any boxed game released this year so far, with sales 40% higher than the previous best, that being Animal Crossing New Horizons, which is very interesting. And so there you go, guys. It seems as though, regardless of the controversy and the divisiveness surrounding this game, it's off to a really, really solid sales start, which, I guess at the very least, even if you're not a fan of The Last of Us Part 2 story, or it's a game that you just really aren't a fan of at all, at the very least, one positive we can take from this is a AAA single-player story-driven game, once again, selling really well. And there is something always to be said for that, and I will always support that, even if, I'm not 100% on board with the story being told, but still, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. I have my review coming up of the game. I'm still working on finishing it, but there you go. I just wanted to keep you guys in the loop and let you know that it's selling really well. The interesting thing here, well, there's a few interesting things. The first is, will it continue to sell well with all of this controversy surrounding it? How many people are going to return the game or trade it in or sell it, or something along those lines, or will all of this divisiveness actually end up helping the game when it comes to sales? Certainly didn't stop it from getting off to a really good start, the leaks that is. And the other question is, will it break the current record holder, that being Spider-Man PS4, selling 3.3 million units in just 3 days? If it's going to break that record, Sony will announce that within the next week or two, and it will be interesting to see if it does. Now, finishing this video, we're talking about, apparently, The Last of Us Part 3. In a recent interview with IndieWire, when asked about the potential of The Last of Us Part 3, Druckmann explained that another sequel would have to go through the same test Part 2 went through, whether or not Naughty Dog can find more new and interesting ways to tell a story rather than treading old ground. According to Druckmann, that was already hard enough with Part 2 and will become exponentially harder with Part 3. He says that currently he does not have ideas for how to do that. I'll be a little vague and cagey, as you can expect, but I think the test for whether or not to make Part 3 would have to be a similar test to what we did with Part 2, Druckmann said. With the first game, there were no expectations and it was like we could do anything. But now that we've established certain characters and themes and processes, it felt like to justify making Part 2, we had to do something not that fans would be something that fans would not be comfortable with, but do something that would match the emotional core we found in the first game, and without that, there'd be no reason to do Part 3. Finding it with the sequel was much harder than it was with the first game, and going forward it would be exponentially harder to justify going back to that world and finding a way to vary things up, he continued. There's already so many things you've seen about the backstory, about how the outbreak happens, so we'd really have to figure out how to create a new experience that matches the emotional impact of these stories, and I don't know what that is currently. So I just wanted to highlight this because, first of all, it seems that Neil Druckmann is essentially maybe hinting at us that if there's ever going to be a Part 3, it's not going to be their next title. I say this because if that was the case, considering how well the game is selling, how well it's doing in general, I mean, obviously there's a lot of controversy surrounding it, but still it's selling really well. If they were up to doing Part 3, I think maybe he would be saying something completely different, like, yeah, I already have all these different ideas, and just letting us know that we can expect it. But right now, it seems like he has no ideas. I mean, maybe that's a good thing. And the other thing I wanted to mention about this is that, frankly, I'm kind of glad to hear this. Again, I have yet to do my final review of the game, but I will say that regardless of how I end up feeling once I fully complete the game, at this point, I am ready to see Naughty Dog do something completely new and completely different. And, the truth of the matter is, guys, this controversy surrounding this game is going to stick with Naughty Dog. And it's certainly going to be brought up when they announce whatever their next project is, which I have no idea when that's going to be. But I feel like the best chance of maybe just, recapturing the excitement in general for everybody is just do something different. Do something new. I'm hearing that Naughty Dog may have something they're doing, a new IP that'll be space themed or something along those lines, which sounds awesome to me. I'm ready to move on from Uncharted and The Last of Us at this point, and I'm ready to see what Naughty Dog can do with another blank slate. So that's why I'm mentioning this, because it seems likely that Neil Druckmann and Naughty Dog are maybe thinking the same thing. So I will say this, and this is the last thing I'm going to say. Naughty Dog is already currently working on something. We just don't know what it is. And I think it's safe to assume that it's much more likely they're working on a new IP than Part 3. Because once game production wraps up, there's usually already pre-production of a new title, whether that's a new IP or sequel. So I think it's likely it's going to be something completely new and different. So that's going to do it for the video, guys. It did run a bit long, but I had a lot to say and we had a lot to go over. So let me know your thoughts about all this down in the comments below. Again, leave the video a like if you did enjoy it or found it informative. Subscribe to the channel if you're new and haven't already. Hit the bell notification icon so you never miss an upload, and feel free to share this video out on top of all that. But until next time, guys, take care.